So today's chair of the session, Professor Dr. T. Tulasidaran sir. Welcome, sir. So we'll start the program.
Thank you. Thank you, Sibuji Nato. Good afternoon to you all, and warm welcome to the second day of the national webinar on interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary education approaches and reflections, jointly organized by School of Pedagogical Sciences and Directorate of Minority Welfare, Government of Kerala. Am I audible, Sibu? Am I audible?
Yes, sir. You're audible, sir.
Okay. I am Professor Dr. Tulasidaran, Pedagogical Sciences, Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam, Kerala. At the very outset, I wish to thank our university authorities, especially our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Sabu Thomas sir, Pro Vice Chancellor, Sri Arvind Kumar, and Registrar Sri Prakash sir, for the wholehearted support for this webinar. Today we have with us our head and the general convener of the webinar, Professor Medikuti A, and chief guest of the day, Professor Kalpana Kanabidan, Madam. Professor Kalpana Kanabidan, Madam, is a regional director, Council for Social Development, Hyderabad. Convener, Dr. Saji Matthew, Principal Coaching Center for Minority Youth, Directorate of Minority Welfare, Kayangulam. Organizing Secretary, Sibu G. Neto, Assistant Professor, School of Pedagogical Sciences, Mahatma Gandhi University. Coordinators, Dr. Ismail Tamarsheri, Assistant Professor, School of Pedagogical Sciences, Dr. Muhammad KV, Assistant Professor, School of Pedagogical Sciences, and organizing committee members, Dr. T.V. Tulasidaran, Dr. Jaya Jays, Dr. Asha JV, Dr. Rajna Jeli, Associate Professor, Dr. Asina VN, Principal Coaching Center for Minority Youth, Directorate of Minority Welfare, Matancheri. Rapporteurs, Anu M. George, Sonia Prem Kumar, Roshni Salil, all the research scholars from School of Pedagogical Sciences, and esteemed participants. It is my pleasure and privilege to welcome and introduce our chief guest of the day, Professor Kalpana Madam. Kalpana Madam is a regional director of Council for Social Development, Hyderabad. And Professor Kalpana Madam is an Indian sociologist and eminent lawyer. He took his PhD in sociology from Jawaharlal Nehru University and LLM degree in jurisprudence in Usmania University. And he is a versatile genius in the field of both sociology and law. And Professor Kalpana Kanabidan was also part of the founding faculty of National University of Law, and she taught sociology and law for a decade from 1999 to 2009. Professor Kalpana Kanabidan is also a co-founder of the Asmita Research Center for Women Rights Group, and also Professor Kalpana Kanabidan is also a member in various committees and commissions of Government of India. Now he is a General Secretary of Indian Association of Women's Studies. And moreover, he has authored many number of books and edited many number of books in his credit. In 2013, Kalpana Kanabidan was awarded Amartya Sen Award for her outstanding work in the field of law. Madam has also awarded in 2003, he was awarded B.K.R. Rao Prize for Social Science Research from ICSSR, and also he has so many contributions in the social service department. And the highlight of his Kalpana Kanabidan is the daughter of notable human rights activist KG Kanaviran and Kanaviran, a feminist writer and founding member of women movement in India. We are very happy for your esteemed presence. We are also thankful for your acceptance for sharing your view with our national webinar. And in this webinar, we are very happy to you the topic reflection the topic law, gender and social science, the reflections on disciplines and interdisciplinarity relevance. On behalf of MG University, School of Pedagogical Sciences and Directorate of Minority Welfare Government of Kerala, I extend a very warm welcome you, Madam, for this webinar. I also invite to deliver the today's lecture. And I extend a very warm welcome to all the esteemed participants for the with the simple words. Let me wind up. Once again I invite Professor Kanaviran to deliver the lecture. Over to you, madam. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Professor Tulsidharan. And I would like to thank all the organizers at MG University Kotte for this kind invitation to me to speak at your webinar. The topic that I was requested to speak on is, of course, and what I will do is to try and signpost my talk with the ways in which I myself have approached the question of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity as indispensable to the practice of social science in India. I say in India because my work has been rooted here. I have lived all my life in India, and I have studied here. So my familiarity with the Indian context is much more and much deeper than my familiarity with other contexts. Nevertheless, I do believe that there are some basic premises that are generalizable, and we can discuss that. In speaking of gender and law, I would like to briefly trace the history of this connection between gender and law. There have, of course, been people of all genders, women particularly, who have been present right through history, whose voices we are able to discern through history, but who did not necessarily enter the historiographic accounts of Indian society over different periods across different regions. It required the it required the ascendance of the women's movement and feminist scholarship in the country in the late 1970s, particularly, to resurrect women's presence in history. So already to begin speaking about women and the way women constitute the publics in ways that are distinctive from the way in which men, for instance, may constitute the public. But in order to speak about the way, to begin to see the way women constitute the publics, it actually required the inaugural move towards interdisciplinarity, breaking down gendered boundaries in history through the sensibilities of women's studies and feminist scholarship. So in that sense, scholarship that looks primarily through a gender lens is already foundationally interdisciplinary. So whether it is the earlier disciplinary formation of women's studies or its transformation into a radical formation of gender studies, gender and sexuality studies, the fact of interdisciplinarity is foundational to that entire discipline, if one may call it that. One of the earliest preoccupations with one of the earliest preoccupations of women's studies in the mid and late 1970s was with the status of women. If you remember the 1975 Towards Equality report, for the first time mapped the status of women on different indices in the economy, in relation to law, in politics, in employment, across different realms. How does the status of women measure up? That was also the first time that there was a concerted evaluation of the ways in which laws were in practice and in formulation androcentric and not giving of the idea of equality for women. From the Towards Equality report, and I would certainly say that the Towards Equality report of 1975, which was a report for the government of India, but put together by eminent women's studies and feminist scholars across different disciplines. So you had Veena Majumdar, you had Lautika Sarkar, you had Leela Dubey, you had Sharda Muni, you had a whole range of very senior, the first generation of independent feminist scholars from different disciplines coming together to reflect on the status of women in India. So already there you have the idea of interdisciplinarity as something that is indispensable to an understanding of marginality, of discrimination, and of disentitlement. Because when we are speaking of women's status in the 1970s, we are speaking of marginality and disentitlement. Of course, in the present time, whether one is speaking of Hadia in Kerala or Sabarimala or Hathras, we are again speaking of marginality and disentitlement in very different forms and very different realms. And add to that the fact of the total lack of representation of women in the judiciary, particularly in constitutional courts. In the Supreme Court, you have only 2 women. Usually the norm is 1 woman judge at any given time. And in Parliament, you know that our parliamentarians across parties have staunchly resisted reservations for women in Parliament. So the Panchayat Raj institutions are, of course, the most democratic because we have a constitutional provision to bring women in. But as you go higher, the exclusions of women in the public domain only increases. So the question of justice is then tied to the question of representation, and both justice and representation are questions that are fundamentally interdisciplinary. Because what are the realms that different disciplines inhabit? And if we are, I will confine myself to the social sciences. But if we look at the ways that disciplines are constituted, how do women figure as people with specific life experiences? How do men figure? And how does gender figure outside of this binary? Because we are at a point in understanding the question of gender where we are saying that gender is not limited to a binary classification of men and women. So we have already moved. And in fact, when you look at gender and the whole discussion on gender mainstreaming, particularly in public policy, in governments, in legal aid systems, and in questions of representation, gender is often watered down to saying, yes, we need to have a gender component, meaning we need to include one or two women as a token presence. And the one thing that I have always taught, whether to law students or to students of the social sciences or to students of women's studies or any other discipline, is that gender is not limited to women alone. No human being is absent of gender. So when I speak about gender as the basis of representation, that representation could be over-representation, it could be under-representation, it could be absence of representation. But it includes everybody. Every single person is a bearer of gender. How would we understand the crime, for instance, of sexual assault, or what we know in legal language as rape? How would we understand the crime of rape if we only spoke about women as bearers of gender? The crime of rape is a crime of power of one gender over another. It is a crime that is facilitated by patriarchal power. And that patriarchal power vests in men in particular societies. So I think that the primary distinction one needs to make, or the primary clarification, that one needs to make in speaking about gender, which comes across very strongly when one talks about law, is we must articulate the position of men, the position of women, and the position of gender outside of binary classifications as a fluid category that is a question of self-identification and choice, not the question of biology. So already then we are in other realms or in other disciplinary realms. We are talking about politics. We are talking about history. We are also talking about the biomedical sciences, because there is a very strong link that the understanding of law has to biological narratives or biological determinist narratives on what a person's appropriate gender is. And it is on that basis then that laws are applied or policies are framed for particular populations. So there is a form of biopolitical control in which gender regimes are very central. And those gender regimes are dependent on fixated and situated knowledges of biological determinism. And we need to then understand that none of these are necessarily fixed, and proceed to looking at interdisciplinarity from that standpoint. So if we then open the field out and we say, how do we understand the positioning of law in gendered terms? We would then come across several branches of law: property law, the law of crimes, civil laws, of which family laws are a big part. The law of contracts, the law of torts, intellectual property. What is it that constitutes a knowledge system? And in whom does the prerogative of owning knowledge based? So every one of, you could go on indefinitely. Every one of the realms of law that you open out are realms that are structured by gender in very, very different and yet very similar ways. So, for instance, if you were to look at family laws, and you look at the law of, and you look at criminal law, particularly if you look at the law of rape, you will find that they are in fact complementary to each other. So that for a person, for a man to have forced sexual intercourse with his lawful wife without her consent does not come within the meaning of rape, because she is constructed in law as the property of the husband that she has married. Whereas a man engaging in sexual intercourse without consent of the woman outside of marriage is constructed as rape. So already when you are, the point that I'm trying to make in bringing the law of crimes and family law together is to point out the ways in which the law itself is ideologically structured within patriarchal systems. So when we view this, for instance, from the standpoint of political theory or political science, what we then come up with is, how does the law function within democracy? What does democracy then mean for men and women? What does citizenship mean? What does citizenship mean for a man, and what does citizenship mean for a woman? Is the idea of birthright citizenship or freedom something that is equally available to men and women? And in this case, we can take the simple case of Hadia, since MG University is in Kerala. If an adult woman decides to convert of her own free will and marry out of choice, and yet the court gives custody of that adult woman to the father when the woman has chosen to step out of the family, what does that tell us about a woman, any woman? So that the lesson is not limited to that one woman alone. The lesson is then general to all women in the Indian polity. What does that tell us then about the right of women, Indian women, to citizenship? Because citizenship means freedom, and it means the freedom to make certain choices that are set out quite clearly in the Constitution. And the Constitution is then the framework for the devolution of citizenship. So the relationship between gender and law, while we can mechanically view the question of gender and law in terms of different laws, so the law of rape, the law of domestic violence, sex selective abortions, choice marriages, forced marriage, child marriage. So we can multiply the fields in which the law operates in a discriminatory manner for women. Or the other method of doing it is to say, what are the core tenets on which this polity is built? What are the core concepts on which our understanding of ourselves as a free people is based? And how must those core concepts then inform our approach to the study of gender to the study of law and to the study of Indian society. And when we talk about Indian society, then we are speaking per force of all disciplines that have a relevance to Indian society, because the idea of an Indian society, and I'm not saying you could even say Indian societies, plural societies. The idea of Indian societies is that the kaleidoscopic terrains of life, of social life, are encompassed and by a multitude of disciplines that then overlap with each other. So that we then need to approach the question of, of the relationship between gender and interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity through this open-ended question that is not bounded and that is not confined within a particular disciplinary narrative. There has recently been some work, and scientists have actually been late in coming to this area, but there has been some work on the ways in which science is an exclusionary domain. And of course, we have, not in the present, unfortunately, but till very recently, a fairly efficient, robust, and vocal establishment of modern science that did not fall back on obscurantism or proving aerodynamics in ancient India and so on. So we had a fairly robust, robust presence of the scientific temper in modern science in India. During that period of the robust presence of modern science, we still had the phenomenon of a minuscule number of women making it into the formal establishment of modern science. Which means what? It means basically that both science education and the professional pursuit of science, while modern in the way in which it constructed knowledge, was still hampered by the societal boundaries of gender in ways that excluded women from rising up in the pursuit of science. So you have very, very few women who have risen up in the pursuit of science. Till very recently, you also had very, very few women who had risen up in the pursuit of law. You have a minuscule number of women who have actually entered the judiciary. And there again, Kerala has a point of distinction with Justice Anna Chandy. But you have a minuscule number of women who actually rose to become judges. And the question then for an understanding of gender and law is, why is it that we speak about law? We speak about law, I think, because we believe that a discourse on justice, or what Amartya Sen called the idea of justice, because a discourse on justice is central and indispensable to a collective social life. So the concern with gender and law is not a concern with technical law. What does the Evidence Act say? What are the provisions? How can you apply the law in a very black letter manner? That's not really the reason why we are speaking about gender and law. Even raising the question of gender and law as a problematic that needs to be discussed means that we see that there is a problem, there is an issue with the idea of justice when gender and law come together. And it is that problem with the idea of justice that we must try and fix through an interdisciplinary approach. So that then is the route that we take to look at the relationship between gender and law from an interdisciplinary perspective. How do we address the idea of justice? And within this, again, we often face problems of what are the tolerable limits that women can be allowed. Public discourse has never, ever spoken about the tolerable limits for men. Public discourse has always been equivocal. No, this is an aberration. He's a nice man, but, that was an unusual moment. Otherwise, he's a nice man. He only beat his wife a little bit. He's a nice man. He doesn't mean to sexually harass this woman. It just happened once. You have to ignore it. So there is actually no limit and no limitation that public discourse places on men as a class. And when I say public discourse, I mean every aspect of public discourse, from courts to the street. But there is a very heated and animated discussion about what are the appropriate limits for women in their exercise of freedom. Suppose a man has been extremely offensive, and publicly so, whether on social media or on the street, makes little difference. But if he has been extremely offensive and continues to be despite warning, and law enforcement authorities are loath to exercise the limits on his behavior, as they should with anybody who is engaging in offensive behavior. And women then get very agitated and go and beat up the man. They haven't taken guns and killed anybody. They go and beat him up. Have they crossed the limits? Is the immediate question. What about the men who have been offensive, who have indulged in rape, who have indulged in extreme forms of stalking, who have engaged in persistent forms of sexual harassment at the workplace? What are the limits on male conduct? So the question that I began with is a question that I have landed at again at this moment, that when we speak about gender and law, we all too easily slip into a mode of surveillance on women. Okay, this is Indian society. Indian society has these traditions. And within those traditions, okay, it may be a little restrictive for women. So you can have this level of freedom, but no more. The argument, the other side of the argument that I want to place before you is, considering women are not the only bearers of gender, can we turn this cart the other way and say, okay, in order to understand the relationship between gender and law, can we exercise some surveillance, or some surveillance is a bad word, but can we exercise some limitations on the conduct of men? On the conduct of men in private realm in relation to their daughters and sisters and wives and mothers, and on the conduct of men in the public realm of the street, of the workplace, of the court, and of the virtual world. can we actually exercise some controls? So why are we not, in fact, opening out our examination of gender beyond looking at this is too much freedom for women? Nothing is too much freedom. If there is a crime that has been committed, that crime has a punishment in the penal code. We don't need public morality to surveil women. As Baba Saheb Ambedkar said at the time that the Constitution was adopted, that what the Constitution gives us is an idea of justice that is rooted in the principles of liberty, fraternity, equality, dignity, freedom of expression, and the freedom to live as birthright citizens. But the Constitution, through all of that, through what Justice Sudarshan Reddy has called the triadic ethical framework, it gives us an ethical framework in which constitutional morality is the founding ethic of this country. And all religious ethics, religious divisions, caste-based discrimination, caste orders, discriminatory regimes against minorities, whatever else, must be measured against constitutional morality, which then forms the bedrock. And constitutional morality is something that encompasses the entire realm of knowledge building. So in speaking of interdisciplinarity then, the questions that I zero in on are two. One, how do we understand the idea of freedom that is not fixated on boundaries for women? Whether these boundaries are elastic or strict or rigid or loose, it doesn't matter. Whether we women are pious or loose or immoral, it doesn't matter. But what is freedom that is not fixated on the boundaries that women must be within? And what is the idea of freedom that takes as its foundational ethic the idea of the Constitution rather than the idea of public morality? That every man on the street or at home knows better than me how I should behave. No. I share as a birthright citizen. I share equally with every other birthright citizen in the country. I share the Constitution, which is a commons. It is common property. It is something that we all inhabit in a shared usufruct. So we expand the notion of property beyond private property to speak of the Constitution as commons, as something in which every one of us has an equal usufruct, and that any behavior that acts as a limitation on a particular class of people falls foul of that founding ethic. And this is really where the idea of justice is rooted and must stay rooted. And you will see that there are many ways in which this has been violated, and we've been speaking about this for 40 years. But you see many ways in which it has been violated even in the recent past. For instance, if you look at the case of Araria in Bihar, where a young woman was gang raped 2 months ago. This is a victim of gang rape who goes to the police, to the magistrate, to file her, to register her FIR along with her counselors. And clearly, any woman knows that rape is extremely, extremely traumatic. So you can't be expected to behave like a rational man after being raped. Because the minute you assume rationality, the idea that the figure that stands before you is the rational man. And so what does the magistrate do? He sends the rape victim to jail on contempt. And he sends her counselors to jail on contempt for being rude to him. This is a woman who has been gang raped. And while she is jailed for contempt, the men who raped her continued to roam free. So you see what I'm talking about when I say that when we look at the idea of freedom or constitutional morality, the most urgent task before us is to lift the idea that freedom comes with limitations and that gender is about women. These are the ideas that actually must be thrown overboard in order to have a more coeval space, in order to imagine the building of knowledge systems. Within the Constitution as well, and as somebody who has studied and written and taught the Constitution, what I have found is that the one article in the Constitution, the one fundamental right in the Constitution that has never been taught to lawyers as part of constitutional law is Article 17. And for those of you who have not read the Constitution, I would urge you to read it. Article 17 is the ban on untouchability. It is the only practice that is banned under the Constitution. In fact, Professor Upendra Bakshi calls it probably the only instance worldwide of constitutional criminal law. Because it's not just constitutional law. It's not just there shall be no discrimination, there shall be equality, everybody has the right to life and personal liberty except cannot be deprived of life and personal liberty except according to procedure established by law. It's not a general enunciation. Untouchability in all its forms is prescribed under Article 17. And we know that this is not actually taught. The untouchability provision is not taught. We don't, as social scientists, develop a deep understanding of caste orders and untouchability practices because it continues to reign in the social domain and it does not enter the curricular domains of the law. The result of that is what we saw in Hathras. So these are not disciplinary exclusions that are without consequences. These are disciplinary exclusions that come with grave and serious consequences in terms of the loss of life and liberty and dignity, not just for women, but for women, for Dalits, for minorities, for sexual minorities. So there is a very vast expanse that we need to encompass in looking at the question of gendered law and interdisciplinarity. One of the things that we do with the disciplines, and in fact with teaching programs and with curricular programs, is that we attempt to set up new signposts for building knowledge in an effort to enhance the inclusiveness or radical edge of pedagogical practice. The question then before us is to examine curricular content and to look at how curricular content in each discipline practices exclusion. And on what grounds does it practice exclusion? What is what are the ways in which the entire range of social experience, the entire range of structural violence, the entire range of exclusions gets represented equally in curriculums? What is the extent to which curricular agendas speak about and critique the concentration of privilege? We don't ever speak of privilege. We can speak of rights, we never speak of privilege, we never speak of prerogatives. But we do need to speak of privilege and prerogatives and the social basis of privilege and prerogatives and the relationship of those privileges and those prerogatives with the constitutional commons. Is there a limitation that we need to place within curricula on reproducing privilege through pedagogical practice? To what extent are we reproducing hegemony? To what extent are we reproducing gender regimes? And to what extent are we reproducing caste and majoritarian orders through our curricular structure? And what are the concrete ways in which we might, in fact, be able to roll this back and to look at the question of teaching and learning as something that must be guided by constitutional morality? Because that then becomes a kind of beacon that we can follow in order to open out the realms of knowledge that we are seeking to refashion or rebuild. Because if we don't open that out, if we don't interrogate the limitations, and if we don't interrogate the reproduction of privilege and the reproduction of hegemonies, what we are in fact then doing is just perpetuating more of the same order. So we have a token entry of women in the colonial period, or the great Bhakti saints, or these two women writers who wrote very radical writings, Rokeya Sakhawat Hussain, who wrote Sultana's Dream. And it stops with that. But how do you grow Begum Rokeya's dream into the transmission of knowledge through a very radically different pedagogical practice? And speaking of Begum Rokeya, I immediately took me back to the limitations and the boundaries we draw on what the admissible texts are for teaching. When I was teaching Article 17 to law students, this is like maybe 12, 13 years ago, the method that I adopted was that I read out the text of Article 17, which is, like I told you, the abolition, the ban on untouchability. I read out Article 17. I read out a short excerpt from the Constituent Assembly debates on Article 17. And then I did not go to any of the sociological analysis on untouchability or on the caste order. Most notably, I did not teach M.N. Srinivas. Instead, what I did was that I played the documentary film India Untouched in class for collective viewing. And playing that documentary and getting 80 students from very different social backgrounds to view it together made for a very different kind of conversation. Because automatically what students and the student and that's the other thing that we need to remember, that the students who come to us come from a variety of backgrounds, and for the most part they come from extremely conservative, for the most part, and those who come from the marginalized groups come from extreme experiences of vulnerability. And that vulnerability is carried in the cultures of vulnerability, and the cultures of dominance are carried onto our university campuses. We saw that with Rohit Vemula and the entire student movement since 2016. How do you break that hegemony from congealing within classrooms? How do you break the hegemony of dominance from actually solidifying in the classroom? How do you dissipate that and create a space, an interdisciplinary, intertextual space, where a different order of conversations on the collective social experience becomes possible? Because that then makes for a very intersectional conversation between gender and other forms of vulnerability and dominance. And it also helps in a large number of instances to reschool students into thinking differently. So that I have personally found several instances of students who came in from a particular background of thinking, who by the time they left law school were in very different place in terms of the way they thought about themselves as members of Indian society, of that collective that is structured by caste orders and by majoritarian orders. So the idea of an intertextual building of the curriculum, where we are able to use film, we are also able to use literature. For the past few years, I have been working a lot with creative writing, with poetry and with novels and short stories particularly. How does creative writing help us to break the very rigid straitjackets of formal disciplinary texts? I think it's important. I'm not rejecting theory or diminishing the importance of theory. But what we do need to understand is the ways in which narratives of social experience, of narratives of collective experience, the narratives of experiences of particular groups and classes, so how then would we open out discipline? School us into interrogating disciplinary frameworks. In fact, possibly the latest issue of the Economic and Political Weekly has a very interesting article by Professor Shiv Vishwanathan, who is actually talking about how the imagination of the social sciences has fallen into very hard times, particularly in the post-COVID context, and how the normal social scientific endeavor, we have a hypothesis, conduct these interviews, we have a theory, we test the hypothesis against the theory, we have a conclusion, and we have a published paper or dissertation. But that structure, how the pandemic experience has completely dissipated and dismantled that structure, and how we need to think about a social science imagination very differently in this context. Even our sense of time is altered. because we are no longer going in to work by 9, taking a class, at the temporal spatial characteristics of the classroom have changed. So I'm here on a virtual kind of lecture with you. So our sense of time and space has also undergone a radical shift. And one of the things that he, in fact, urges us to do is to revisit our understanding of disciplinary boundaries and disciplinary protocols in trying to imagine the social sciences differently. And he does make a mention of the uses of literature. And I actually wanted to pick up on that, explication of literature to say that we will, through literature, find a number of things. We will be able to track the plural domains of social life. We will be able to track the plural domains of the normative, because there is no single normative that applies across all social domains. So we will be able to track the plural domains of the normative. And we will be able to link those domains of the normative to life as lived, which doesn't always conform to the normative. And we will also be able to link those domains of the normative to the domains of formal law. Is this about law? Are they talking about the police? I was looking at novels around the theme of corruption last month. And every single novel has mention of a magistrate, a constable, a tehsildar, and a wealthy person, and a jailer. Every single novel, wherever you talk about corruption, you have these four are certainly characters in that novel. The daroga, the tehsildar, the collector, the magistrate. So what does that then tell us about how we understand the relationship between corruption as social experience and corruption as law? Now, which disciplinary location will corruption fall in? And the point that I would actually like to end in is a very interesting gender point that comes out in that entire narrative. And I looked at 4 novels and 2 short stories. Out of the 6 works, 2 works were written in the early 20th century, and the remaining between 1970 and 2019. So fairly contemporary, post-colonial. And across all of those novels, and in different languages, Odia, Hindi, Kannada, English, Telugu, across all those different novels, across all periods, all the main protagonists are only men. Whether you're talking about the 4, the daroga, the magistrate, whatever, or you're talking about the landlord, or you're talking about the other characters that circulate and shuttle between all of these entities, the works are entirely peopled by men. The question that I then asked myself, and then if you look at the case law on corruption, at the legal case law on corruption, again you will find that whichever slice, whichever time period you take, the actors are all men, and you have very few exceptions like Jayalalitha. But they are really very, very few, minuscule in comparison to the number of actors and the number of cases you have of men. So if we look at gender as something that is a default setting for women, then we are losing out on the richness of an exploration of the connections between gender and law. And we also lose out in not looking at other textual forms. We also lose out on the rich possibilities that an intertextual curriculum can in fact impart within various disciplinary settings. Thank you very much. Yeah, I've finished. Thank you.
Professor, ma'am, your presentation is over now, no? Ma'am,
Yeah, my presentation is over. I said that, yeah.
I'm audible now, no? Professor, sir? So, dear participants, if you have any queries, you can raise the questions, and the forum is open now. You can unmute your mic and raise the question. Participants, dear participants, if you have any questions, you can put it in the chat box also.
Okay, there are a couple of, one question, I think.
You can that.
Can I just respond? I can find one question from Christine Mendoza to me. I can answer that. She says, how do you deal with false complaints? Well, there is a procedure to deal with false complaints. And one has to just go through with that procedure. I mean, you can never say that a complaint is false unless you go through the procedure and find that it was false. So there can't be a determination that a complaint is false even prior to investigation.
Participants, any more questions? Raise the question by unmuting. Question is there in the chat box. Are there any
What is this? Are there any formal institutions? No, I lost that question.
Ma'am, this is Yadu Prabha. That question was posed by me. I wanted to just ask, are there any formal institutions which come under the judicial management where the students are motivated to join and help the judiciary speed up the process? Because formal training of the regular honors and postgraduate level judicial learnings are lengthy. So there are students who might be helpful in preparing the case and writing it. So are there institutions which help that?
Well, I don't think students can help speed up a judicial process. For a judicial process, you need a thorough understanding of the law, and you need a thorough, and you need to have the experience of dealing with the law. What students can certainly do is to learn from the process. I don't think students, it is a lengthy process for a reason. It's a lengthy process because cases have to do with human lives. And when you are deciding on human lives according to the law, then you must know the law thoroughly. So there are no shortcuts to this. What students can certainly do is to learn about judicial processes and judicial functioning, so that when they come across cases or when there are cases in their working environments at any time in the future, they will be able to understand those cases from a legal lens, and will be able to advise that person on what the appropriate forums, what the appropriate course of action may be, and so on. So I would think that for students, it is really a question of learning. I don't think students can speed up the process unless they have gone through that process of learning.
Ma'am, in a democratic setup,
Yeah.
rule of law is supreme. If we think, when we talk about law at present situation in our country, there is no rule of law. It is just prevailing in written documents. And just the previous question someone asked about, can student help? I think student can help little bit through the writing on the laws, a number of cases. When we say there is no number of laws, number of institutions there, but there is not a perfect law. If we punish, whenever you talk about gender disequalities, rape cases, mostly according to country, people are on the road, other side people are supporting the rapist. So if we have a strong law, and it's better for our society as well as for our nation. Very healthy and informative session. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Can I just kind of make a point of clarification? One, there are laws, and I would certainly like to say this much, that if the police and the judiciary and the investigation agencies followed the criminal procedure code and the laws of evidence by letter and spirit, that itself goes a very long way in embedding the rule of law in the country. The problem is not with people demonstrating. Let's not confuse the two. People will demonstrate for, people will demonstrate against. We have seen that happening in Kerala more than any other place.
Yeah.
People will demonstrate on this side also, on that side also. But the point, the judgment of whether there is rule of law or not does not depend so much on whether people are demonstrating or not. It is determined much more by whether investigating agencies and prosecutorial offices are doing their job according to what is laid down in written law. The problem when you say there is no rule of law in this country, sir, I would urge to study that problem more carefully, because you will find, as I have found, possibly, I have certainly found it, possibly you will find it too. But it is, in fact, the lack of adequate investigation the lack of adherence to the rules of evidence, the lack of commitment in prosecutorial services, that in fact derails the rule of law. It's not public demonstrations that derail the rule of law. And of course, we will come up with, there were some, and on students, of course, they should write. But I think the specific question was whether they can work in judicial, I was referring to a very specific question. It was whether students can work in judicial institutions and help in drafting and speed up cases. That is, it was to that specific question that I responded, that you need to actually learn the law. So certainly interning with judicial institutions will help you learn the law, and then will help you to engage with it, either by counseling or by working in civil society organizations or by writing. There are a couple of other questions. Let me just finish with the questions that I have, please. A couple of other questions had to do with somebody's father or somebody new committed suicide because of false complaints, so on. We will have several anecdotes. I can give you hundreds of thousands of anecdotes of women who have committed suicide, of men who have committed suicide, who have not been able to deal with the stigma of criminalization. But the points that I was raising here in this session, I was not actually addressing myself at all to specific instances of how the law might work. In fact, I very consciously avoided that because I can't do that. I am a case counselor professionally, but I can't do that and do a talk on interdisciplinarity, gender, and law. So that is not something that that was a limitation, if you like, that I drew for my talk, so I can't comment on individual cases. Because for every one case that you find of one kind, you will find 10 cases of another kind.
Question?
Any more questions?
Yeah, are there any agencies or ways to make those who are custodians of law to follow the rules in letter and spirit? Yes, there are agencies and ways, but if the agencies and ways do not want to enforce accountability on the custodians, then that's a whole different problem that we are dealing with. There are agencies, there are ways, there are procedures, but you need governments willing to enforce accountability on their officers. And in most cases, that's where governments fall short. In most cases. On special courts, there are. The other question is on special courts. There are special courts. For instance, the SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act is tried in a special court. So for different offences that are deemed to be grave offences, you do have special courts already constituted. You have a statutory provision according to which the court must be constituted, and that is in existence already.
Any more questions? Any more questions or clarifications? Not all right.
I think one more there in the chat box.
Is there a provision? I mean, the murder laws, murder and culpable homicide laws in the I fairly stringent. You also have the criminal procedure code that is there. So, and I mean, non-bailable doesn't mean that a person cannot get bail. Non-bailable means that the police authority can't give bail, but the magistrate can give bail. And bail is a basic right. It's part of the right to life. So there are, of course, non-bailable offenses across the board. Which offenses are non-bailable?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's all.
Okay.
Cases, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, madam. Thank you so much for your enlightened and informative talk. And now I invite Dr. Muhammad KV for proposing the vote of thanks. Muhammad KV,
Yes, sir.
over to you, sir. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you, madam. Thank you, one and all. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Most respected chair of this session, Professor T.V. Tulasidaran, sir. Today's resource person, Professor Dr. Kalpana Kanambiran. Members of the organizing committee and my dear participants, a very good afternoon. This is the time of express thanks to one and all. I feel so happy to share my gratitude to all for the successful completion of today's session. A special lecture on law, gender, and social sciences, the reflections on disciplines and interdisciplinarity in the second day of this webinar series. Thank you all for your active participation and kind support. At the outset, let me express our sincere thanks to our Honorable Vice Chancellor of Mahatma Gandhi University, Professor Sabu Thomas, the real source of our inspiration and support for all our academic endeavors. He is the real source of motivation to organize this webinar. Thank you, sir, for your frequent encouragement and support. We had an eminent resource person today, Professor Dr. Kalpana Kanambiran. She is the Regional Director, Council for Social Development, Southern Region Center, Hyderabad. My words are not enough to comment on his session. It was truly a wonderful and useful one. We are really proud to have a resource person like you, madam, to handle the session. The comments and feedbacks of observations shared by the participant to the chat box, it is evidence that the session was very informative and useful to all. On the behalf of Organizing Committee, School of Pedagogical Sciences, Mahatma Gandhi University, and Directorate of Minority Welfare, Government of Kerala, I express my sincere thanks to Dr. Professor Kalpana Kanambiran. Thank you, madam. Then I express my gratitude to today's session chaired by our beloved teacher, Professor T.V. Tulasidaran, Senior Faculty of School of Pedagogical Sciences, Mahatma Gandhi University. Thank you, sir. I'm also very much thankful Professor Minikutiye, Professor and Head of the Department of School of Pedagogical Sciences, for her leadership and continuous motivation and support throughout this program. Thank you, ma'am. Then let me take this voice to express my thanks to organizing team of this webinar, our patron, Dr. Moidin Kuti AB, then convener, Saji Matthew, Principal Coaching Center for Minority Youth, Kayangulam, organizing secretary, Dr. Sibuji Neto, coordinator of this webinar, Dr. Ismail Tamarasheri, members of this organizing committee, Dr. Professor Jaya Jais, Professor Asha JV, Dr. Sajina Jalil, Dr. Hazina VN, Principal Coaching Center for Minority Youth, Matanjeri, and rapporteurs of this program, Anu M. George and Soumya Prem Kumar, Roshni Salil, they are the research scholars of School of Pedagogical Sciences, Mahatma Gandhi University, for their coordination, support, organizing leadership. Thank you all. Then let me express my thanks to all the supporting staff of School of Pedagogical Sciences and the office staffs of the Directorate of Minority Welfare for their kind support and organizing support for this webinar. Moreover, I would like to thank all the participants of the webinar. You all make this session fruitful and great success. With the organizing committee expressing all appreciation for your keen interest, active participation throughout this program. On the behalf of School of Pedagogical Sciences, Mahatma Gandhi University, and Directorate of Minority Welfare, Government of Kerala, and the organizing committee, I express a very heartfelt gratitude to one and all participants joined and gathered this virtual platform. Once again, I express my thanks to all. Those who have not mentioned anyone's name here, making this webinar a great success. Thank you once again. Thank you all. See you tomorrow at 2 p.m. for the third session of this webinar series. Till then, goodbye. One more thing, there is a link shared to the chat box for attendance feedback. All are requested to submit the feedback and attendance using the link. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.